Hello, Mike. Welcome to
Hi.
the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for taking the time and for sharing your expertise with us, with me. Yeah. And I always start with the same question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
Uh, Only sometimes. So I guess I've been doing facilitation on and off for quite a long time. But the business that I run is called coaching, but we actually do group work as well as one-to-one coaching. So I guess that would qualify as facilitation. And I also did a thing for the Mid-Atlantic Facilitators Network. So I
Mm.
guess I must be a facilitator, right, if I've done that. That was basically about applying bits of liminal coaching techniques to facilitation. But yeah, so I guess maybe for 10 years.
Oh, wow. And when you say liminal coaching techniques, what do you
Mm.
mean by that?
Liminal coaching is my own development. It's loosely based on solutions-focused brief therapy solutions-focused hypnotherapy that I qualified in about 7 years ago after I bailed out of my corporate career. And I've done an awful lot of work and further research and investigation since then to broaden that out. So very briefly, the techniques involve guided relaxation and a solutions-focused approach to asking questions and investigating problems and issues. But also we have a special thing in terms of facilitation for groups, which I call metaphor mind mapping, where we do a collective, create a collective metaphor map of a particular issue or situation that a group or team of people want to explore. So liminal coaching relies on a very deep practice of understanding and applying metaphors.
Mm, thank you. There are a few things that come to my mind. Um, and curiosities. So one is when I hear hypnotherapy and the way you describe your approach, it sounds a lot like slowing down, reflecting inside. And when I hear liminal, it's about and the mind mapping. And from our previous exploration call, the liminal space being between the conscious and the unconscious. So what I hear is a deep process.
Mm.
And I wonder and would be curious how you navigate that in an environment where organizations, as I have encountered them, are always short in time, rushing into things, usually not preparing meetings, workshops, not debriefing. So, how do you create this time for such deep work?
Well, it can be a little bit of a mission, really, but you don't necessarily have to use an enormous amount of time to do deep work. What is important is that you use some time to completely and absolutely relax.
Mm.
That's probably the key thing. But actually, I've worked with a lot of people suffering from overwhelm and burnout. And one of the things that I teach them to do is to stop every hour and deliberately daydream for
Mhm.
3 to 5 minutes. Because we now know that when you drop into daydream, everyone does it, you're just gazing out of the window, looking at nothing in particular, and your mind feels like it's just coasting. But actually, an awful lot of stuff starts happening at a subconscious level. A large neural network called the default mode network switches on. And one of the things it does is to actually help to solve for massively complex problems.
Mm.
So for people who are working in creative roles that require a lot of imagination and they require innovation and so on, mind wandering or daydreaming is a real asset. And it's one which I encourage people to practice. It reduces their overwhelm and it increases their productivity.
I can totally see that and wonder about the way to break the vicious circle of being in overwhelm and therefore not being able to relax and actually get into this daydreaming mode. And I can relate to myself. I recently started smoking again, hoping that by the time this podcast is released, I stopped.
Okay.
But I realized that one reason why I got back into this unhealthy, toxic habit is that it actually helps me get into the state of daydreaming, because this is maybe one of the few moments that I would spend time on myself without any digital device,
Mm. Mm.
maybe even without a pen and paper.
Mm.
And I wonder how to get into this daydreaming mode without these toxic habits
Mm.
and without, because the other extreme would be meditation. And again, when I listen to you, meditation seems like almost forceful. You have to sit down and you are not allowed to think about anything. No, just observe.
That's actually a very, very interesting point, because one of the main things about liminal coaching, which works particularly well for people who are neurodivergent, who might have, for example, ADHD, is that it doesn't require you to follow what's being said. You can even go to sleep if you want to. All you need to do is just lie there and drift, and that's it.
Mm.
So it's very different to ordinary meditation from that point of view. But interesting what you were saying about smoking. I think that you could replace it with anything else which actually switches on your parasympathetic nervous system as opposed to your sympathetic nervous system, or emphasizes it. So one of the reasons I think that we tend to smoke or eat or drink when we've got anxiety and when we want to calm down is because actually you can't swallow without switching into your parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest side of the nervous system. And that's associated with being in that state where you're calmer and things can occur to you and you're more relaxed and so on. So yeah, we focus a lot on different ways of helping people to get into that state.
And now I see the relation to the breathing work, because the inhalation with the smoking, similar to drinking or eating, is this, yeah, swallowing as you described it.
Yeah, yeah. Mm. So you could probably replace it if you remembered to do so. And it's not always easy to remember to do these things, by doing some simple breathing from your diaphragm, breathing from the stomach.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why everyone recommends that, is because it always works. It puts a little bit of pressure on the vagus nerve, which is the main nerve in the parasympathetic nervous system. So it actually helps that to switch on, and that sends a very fundamental message to your amygdala, your flight fight center, saying that it's okay to calm down, that things are all right.
And then by calming down, we free up space for this creative thinking
Yeah.
that would then relate to what you call the mind mapping.
Yes. Well, metaphor mapping is something specific and different that we do with groups. Mind mapping is something I do because I think it's really useful to just draw things out. I'm always doing it. But that's a bit different. That because it engages more of the right hemisphere of the brain, the more systemic part of our thinking. So as my friend Dave Gray likes to say, if you want to understand how something's working, then you need to draw it, because there you get an insight into how the system fits together rather than a list of parts.
And does this apply to anyone? Because again, if I think of myself, I'm a list writer. I love my bullet points. And I don't feel I get overly self-conscious when I'm want to draw, just because
Ah,
I'm lacking the skills. So
uh,
how do you get people then to overcome this?
Well, I'm not a
self-consciousness?
visual facilitator, but I know quite a few for one reason or another. And Dave Gray's favorite technique for that is something called squiggle birds, and I think he got that from somebody else. Can't remember the name now.
Maybe
But when
from Sunny Brown?
you just do it. No, it wasn't. It was from somebody in Cardiff, whose name escapes me. You just do a squiggle on the paper, and then put a beak and a pair of wings anywhere, and you've got a bird. So, you know, it's to get people past the idea that they can't draw. It doesn't you don't have to be good at it. My own stuff is usually circles with words inside, and then connecting lines and things like that. And there might be a few rudimentary bits of cloud or something in there sometimes. But yeah.
So, and then if you say metaphor mapping, what I hear is to find a simplified version of an idea, maybe a little drawing, maybe a bird or something that will then also help us to switch on a different part of our brain.
Well, metaphor is the fundamental basis of how we do all our thinking. That's how our system of conception works, is by pattern matching. And it's really about how metaphor is the language of the unconscious. And by thinking up or allowing a metaphor to emerge for something that you're thinking about or something that you're trying to resolve, what happens is you come up with an image which has all kinds of other associations than the problem as you are thinking of it normally. And it changes completely how you might look at it. I can give you an example, because we do a game at the end of my webinars. We often do a game which I call the metaphor game. And it's basically, we ask anyone to think of an issue or a problem or something they're working with, and to think of a metaphoric landscape for it. Where are they? What does the landscape look like? So we had one person who said, well, my landscape is a desert island. I'm on my own. There's one tree. There's no food. There's no water. And there's no one else there. There's no boat. There's no way off. And then you start either asking yourself, or somebody else can help with this. You start asking questions about the landscape. So in this case, the question was, do any ships or boats come past the island ever? Oh, yes, quite a lot of ships and boats come past the island. And do any of them ever come close enough to hear you if you shout, or see you if you wave? Yeah, yes, of course they do. They do. Yeah. God, that makes so much sense. And it turned out that the person who was doing that particular exercise was suffering from isolation, and had been since COVID had made it worse, social isolation. And what going through that metaphor process actually allowed them to see was that, in actual point of fact, there were lots of people in their vicinity that they could reach out to and connect with if they wanted to. But they hadn't thought of it before actually picturing themselves on the island and then thinking of the boats going past and so on.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for this example. I'm glad that I asked for the metaphor mapping, what you meant by that. Yeah.
So what we do with groups is really interesting. Well, at least I think it is.
And this would have been my next question, how you do that with groups.
So I would think it's interesting, right?
Yes.
But with a group, what we do is the group needs to have a shared aim that they're working on. So it might be like, we want to improve the innovation in the team or something like that. Right? And then what we do is we ask them, we actually take them on a little guided relaxation, a short guided relaxation. And in that guided relaxation, they get given a painting, which is the landscape of the issue for them, right? And then when we bring them back, we ask them, what was in your landscape? What was in your landscape? Each person then puts onto a Miro board or something similar what was in their landscape on stickies, in bubbles, right? So we build up a picture of the landscape of the issue, of the problem, from all the different members of the team. And what happens is that as they start putting up their own metaphors, everyone else is looking at them and they're going, oh yeah, I understand that. Or I can see how that fits in. And well, because here's the mountain of possible problems, and here's the river of not enough money, and here's the abyss of too little time and stuff like that. And then we look at drawing a line, a path through time, through those metaphors. So this is the journey. What's the metaphor of the journey? So we then create a bespoke, a special guided relaxation, which is composed of the composite metaphor landscape from all of the team who are involved. And we ask them to listen to that while they're going to sleep, and then we work with them individually as well.
Beautiful. And what comes to my mind is this idea of solving problems while being asleep.
Yeah.
So really, and for me, that's a beautiful actually showcase of what facilitation could be like when we come back to the root of the word, making it easy.
Mm. Yes, I think that's right. I do think actually that an awful lot of what we do could be a very great deal easier simply by paying attention to how much we lose when we focus on always feeling that we have to be seen to be busy. Right. So when I give clients the tool Liminal Pomodoro, which just describes to them, this is a version of the Pomodoro time technique, only you set your timer for an hour, and then at the end of the hour, you stop and you deliberately daydream for 3 to 5 minutes, and then you go back to what you were doing. When we give them that, we also give them an additional, in the handout, there are links to a number of articles from well-researched psychology magazines and so on, papers and so on, which actually support this, which provide the evidence for why mind wandering and daydreaming is actually key to creativity. So, and the reason for doing that is so that if they're sitting at their desk and they're gazing out of the window, having their 5-minute break, and someone comes along and goes, why are you staring out of the window when you should be working? They can say, here, read this.
I love that.
So it's a bit of a mission of general education as well. But when you think about it, it has a lot to do with how we really need to move away from a perception of work and the role of people as being units in an industrial machine. So, moving on from the Industrial Revolution thinking, and we're way behind in doing that, I think.
Yeah. And something similar came to my mind, thinking of how many people in their professional lives actually don't feel as if they're doing creative work. And I wondered to what extent there is a mindset shift needed in order to bring this back to their awareness, because I'm thinking of now all the AI tools at our hands that are basically taking over all the repetitive, non-creative work. And how to get, for instance, a project manager back into the mindset that their work is creative instead of trying to chase people to do their work. Scheduling meetings that nobody has prepared and nobody has time to debrief, and putting together Excel list with all the tasks nobody has time to do.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that we focus on is in terms of AI is saying, what it really highlights is the fact that competitive differentiation in the future is going to be down to how skilled the people in an organization are at things like intuition, creativity, empathy, and vision.
And asking the right questions.
Absolutely, asking the right questions. Yeah.
Because if we ask AI the wrong questions, we get the wrong answers.
We could go on for a long time, but questions is one of my favorite things. I think questions are one of the most powerful defining statements that you can make about anything. Because actually, when you sync up a question, when you ask a question, although it sounds like you're just asking for an answer or for information, what you're actually doing is you are setting the boundaries of the entire discourse. You're actually saying what the whole conversation is going to be about.
Ooh, I love that. And yes, if it's a skillfully asked question. And I think that's a challenge many, especially beginner facilitator, have, that they're asking either too broad questions or too limited questions. And if they're too broad, we fail at describing this boundary. And if they're too limited, we're limiting the creativity and basically implying our bias or putting our bias on the solutions or the answers.
I actually spent about 9 months integrating a prediction market for a large consulting organization. So for most of that 9 months, I was deeply involved in designing questions for the prediction market. So that was actually really interesting. And that led me to ask some very deep questions about questions themselves.
Yeah. So asking questions is also one of my favorite topics. And I have the impression, or one provocative statement I like to open these either talks or workshops with is that I say that I believe most leaders and organizations are asking the wrong questions.
Oh, yeah. You're right, though. You're absolutely right.
Because many, and I think still in trainings, we're asking questions for which there is an answer. And I think if there is a clear answer, we don't need to ask the question. We can Google it or put it into ChatGPT. So according to you, what does it take to learn to ask better questions again, or the right questions?
That's really interesting, that question, because I think, and this goes to explaining why it is that I think a lot of organizations are not great places to work. The thing about getting people to ask questions which are really meaningful is that they have to be in a place where they are not frightened. They're not frightened of not knowing something, right? And that means that you really need to calm down the amygdala. You need to switch into the parasympathetic nervous system. You need to feel you're in a place where it's completely safe to ask even fundamental questions like, is the company that I'm working for even doing the right thing? For example.
It actually also means to decoupling the question from the answer, because if it doesn't feel safe to ask a question or to give an answer, it means that there is a value statement that there's a right and wrong answer, or there is an answer at all. And I think that, yeah, our educational system or even our upbringing has trained us in a way that when we ask a question, we stress because there is a specific answer someone waits for. So what actually needs to happen is to decouple that training our, air quotes, audience to the fact that when we're asking questions, we genuinely don't know the answer.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting and very important. And I think that also goes back to metaphor, because metaphor allows you to look at the questions you are asking in a new way. So there's an outfit, I think they're still based in Seattle. I think it's called Synectic's World, and they've been using metaphor since the late 60s in their innovation process. They describe it as a way of making things strange, making what's normal strange, so you can see new aspects and new perspectives of it. And so I think that also plays into that.
Yeah.
But it's certainly using techniques to help people get into a place where they're relaxed and their anxiety is greatly reduced, means that they're going to be much more creative. They're going to be much more open. They're going to be much more fluid. And that's one of the things that we aim to do.
Yeah. And I wonder whether you have a technique or an approach to help groups to get into the state of collective relaxation. Because being in a state of relaxation, of slowing down, I think there's inherent vulnerability in that. And I wonder whether maybe also this busyness in organizations is a defense mechanism, because the moment we relax, we slow down, suddenly things can happen, maybe out of control. And as long as we feel busy, we feel in control.
Yeah, I mean, we did a short program of work with 6 members of the exec team of a large New York PR agency, and the way that we worked there was to start off the first half of each session with some background information about what we were going to do and how it worked, and then some very simple but very effective breakouts. And the breakouts were where they asked one another to tell each other 4 to 5 things which had happened to them that they really enjoyed in the past week. Okay, very simple, very, very simple.
Very deep.
But what we know, you see, there's method in the apparent simplicity, because what we know from fMRI scanning is that when you remember something which has been good, even if it's just a nice cup of coffee, 2 things happen. The blood supply to your amygdala, which is your flight-fight center, is reduced, so you start calming down. And a little jolt of serotonin is sent into your brain, which is the I feel good, I can cope neurotransmitter. So by the time you've gone through 4 or 5, your brain state's changed, you're calmer, and you're feeling more able to cope with things. But also amongst these people, they said after the session, they actually reported back saying, you know what, I've been working with this person for 8 years, and I know more about them now than I have done in the past 8 years, just through 5 minutes of saying, oh, what did you enjoy? One of the fascinating things about that particular technique is that the amount of serotonin released by remembering having a cup of coffee is pretty much the same as the amount of serotonin that would be released by remembering winning the Pulitzer Prize. So it's not linear. It's not linear, which is a good thing to know, because what that means is that by remembering these small pleasurable incidents that have happened, especially maybe just before you go to sleep, for example, if you're feeling tense, it lowers the blood supply to your amygdala and it increases your serotonin levels a little bit.
And this then also relates to the effectiveness of gratitude activities.
Yes, it does. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we would start, we work in where we actually, in the first half of a group session, we would set up that kind of situation, that sort of priming, relaxing, collaborative kind of background, and then use the guided relaxation for the second half. So by the time we've done that, then everyone is really ready to completely relax and follow the guided relaxation or go with it. And we adjust the guided relaxation depending on what they want to work on. So in the case of the PR agency, we were looking at connecting with the creative well of the subconscious and increasing the sense of collaborative creativity amongst the team.
Mm.
They were skeptical to begin with, by the way, but they were knocked out by the time we finished and said, well, we want to do that again.
Beautiful. And congrats. And I'm not surprised that they've been skeptical in the beginning.
Yeah.
How upfront are you with your techniques when new clients approach you? Or is it specifically for that? Because I can imagine that for the general organization, it is rather counterintuitive.
It really depends on the person. It really depends on the organization, and it depends on the person. So I actually worked with most of the team of a boutique innovation consulting company in Toronto for about a year, doing a session a week with each of them, because they were very, very open to it, and they were working in a way which was highly collaborative. They wanted to do it, and they found it immensely beneficial. So it's down to the organization, down to the people involved. But I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that solving some of this stuff, working with some of this stuff is a major key to increased effectiveness, increased productivity, way beyond anything that we're doing at the moment. You've only got to think about how much benefit, how much is lost in the average organization by people either subconsciously or even consciously defending themselves, defending their position, refusing to supply information, refusing to collaborate, worrying that somebody else is going to get ahead of them on the next rung of whatever ladder, and so on. So to my mind, if you're losing, say, 25% of your productivity through that, and I think that's probably a pretty low number, then if you can reduce that by 20%, you're seeing a huge improvement in the overall productivity of the organization.
Yeah, because also if you can reduce this overall anxiety, you improve communication skills, being open to different opinions because you're not afraid of losing your job, being overworked, and all these kind of worries that are in the back of our minds.
Everything improves, basically.
And I just wrote down three topics that I hope that we can touch upon based on what you've shared so far. One is burnout. You mentioned that you work a lot with people who suffer from burnout or overwhelm, maybe on the way to burnout. How do you, and I recently came across someone who said that burnout is the result of having, of the work reality being misaligned from our own values and beliefs. So the larger the gap over the longer time will at some point get us closer to a burnout, just because it.
Well, in the model that we use, we say that everyone has a stress reservoir.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And during the day, various things happen, and the level of stress in your stress reservoir may go up to here. And we've got a natural mechanism for dealing with that, which is REM sleep. And during REM sleep, what happens is that a lot of the memories of what's been stressful are drained of their emotion. And they're also put onto what they call the narrative timeline. So they're given a position in your personal history, which lets you know they're in the past. And there's actually the REM state, when it's processing like that, uses an enormous amount of energy. So the brain limits the amount of REM sleep that you can get, generally to around 20% of the whole sleep cycle during the night. And if you try to exceed it, then you'll wake up quite suddenly. And if you do succeed in exceeding it, then you can sleep for like 12 hours and wake up the next morning completely exhausted. So there is that natural mechanism there. And we know that during REM sleep, the default mode network switches on. And we know that during daydream and guided relaxation, the default mode network switches on. So we can actually help that process. We actually help that process by using guided relaxation. And the problem is that if you have an enormous amount of stress, and a lot of us do these days, your stress level may go up to here, your reservoir may go up to here and get drained down to there. And then the next day it goes up just a little bit higher and gets drained down to not quite as far. And it slowly creeps up and up and up and up and up until it finally overflows. And that can happen over years. It could, decades even. So it slowly creeps up and up and up and then overflows. And then you get all kinds of problems like irritable bowel syndrome, skin trouble, neuralgia, really physical pains even, as well as maybe bits of OCD and feeling depressed and so on. And so actually draining out the stress reservoir is one of the first things that we work on with people who are suffering from burnout or overwhelm. It's absolutely fundamental. So I had a client who had had chronic and debilitating chest and neck pains for over 2 years. They were a senior character in a booming organization, VP of sales, I think. And they were working all the hours that God sends, and they were bringing work home every day and at the weekends. And they'd been to see 2 different physicians who had both said, well, there's nothing wrong with you. It's just stress. Just stress. This guy's having constant physical pain. I think we did about 6 sessions or something like that, and the pain was then completely gone. But part of that process was to work with them on boundaries, on setting appropriate boundaries. And what we find, or I found with a lot of people who suffer from overwhelm and burnout, is that they have always felt that they must do stuff for other people and they can't say no. So that's quite often one of the things that we need to deal with along the way, is we drain out the stress reservoir, and we also help them to put in place mechanisms which allow them to say no when they need to, so that they can thrive properly. Now, and what happens is that they begin to stop doing the meaningless, busy work that they've been doing in order to try to convince themselves and everyone else around them they're working super hard. I'm not joking.
I hear you. Yeah, I can totally see that.
And this guy ended up, he didn't take work home anymore. He spent the weekends with his family. He had a proper lunch break, and he was more productive, and the pain had gone. So that was actually all about, it was about changing his perception of obligation to be working all the time, as well as actually helping him to drain out all the accumulated stress and become aware of the fact that he would give his best contribution if he was actually flourishing himself and okay and happy and reasonably relaxed.
Yeah. And so I love that. And what I hear a lot from everyone, that boundaries is one of the most difficult things for us to set and maintain. And what I also hear and fear myself are this wall of excuses. And I wonder to what extent, so what are we in control of, and what are we not in control of, and how can we gain control? And I wonder whether this lack of ability to set boundaries is also maybe one of the reasons why most organizations are awful to work in.
Yeah, I think it can be a very big part of it. It really depends on the particular individual case, but quite often I think, and an inability to set boundaries will have its roots in the past and quite often in somebody's childhood. So, for example, growing up in an environment where you're constantly told that you're unlovable unless you do everything that you're told to do, and that includes looking after your younger siblings and doing the washing and doing the washing up and looking after dad when he's completely drunk, and etc., so on and so forth. Then that will have a pretty bad effect in terms of making somebody automatically feel that if they're asked to do something and they say no, then they're an invalid person. So these are the things that we work with at the subconscious level, and which need resolving at the subconscious level because they're subconscious patterns. You can't think your way logically through them. You need to actually have them dynamic. They need to be dynamically released, I think.
Yeah. And this is something that I think is for most beyond the scope of teamwork. So this is kind of deep coaching, therapeutical work. Do you think that there are also ways for team leaders, managers, or even organizations to support their employees to set healthier boundaries without falling into the trap of, no, I stopped doing the work, and then suddenly all the workload just gets passed on different tables and to-do lists?
Yeah, I think it's perfectly possible. I mean, to begin with, I think that the number of people who would actually just stop doing the work is absolutely tiny, tiny percentage. It's about the same percentage of people who are voluntarily free riders. In the studies that they've done studies in the past which show that it's less than 1% the number of people who will free ride even when they're given the opportunity to do so, to not pay. Most people will. Because most people want to contribute, because it's fundamental to our well-being to feel that we are part of something, part of our tribe, part of we belong.
So this then means that most of those we would label as free riders, so looking for the free lunch, doing less work on the shoulders of others, and not doing this consciously. So what are
I think a
their
lot,
blind spots then, and how can we make them aware?
but I think a lot of the time that's a myth, the idea that people are free riding. There will be other reasons why things aren't working like you want them to. Maybe they actually need to, maybe they don't have adequate training and they're too frightened to say they don't understand how to do it properly.
Mm.
There could be lots and lots of different reasons. But to answer your original question about what could organizations do, encouraging a decent work-life balance is one thing, but then also perhaps there's nothing that it would be a very good idea for them to make available to their staff things like we do, services like we provide to help. Because it's something that the company won't do itself, because it's probably too counterintuitive to ask somebody from HR to do it.
To provide time for daydreaming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, or to set boundaries, but both are really important and both will effectively improve productivity.
So does what I hear, and I wonder whether this is true, is assuming that most are actually not consciously free riding. So, and most will not stop doing work.
Mm.
Does it actually mean that we, first of all, have to set boundaries to ourselves
Yeah.
so that we reflect on the work that we are doing and then stop doing the unnecessary work? That sole purpose is there to give us the impression that we are busy.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there's partly that. There's partly the compulsion to always seem to be being productive, but also there's the question of stopping yourself from compulsively saying yes when
Mm.
you're asked to do something, when you already know that you have completely maxed out your schedule for the whole week already. You're already maxed out. You know that you've already got more than enough work to keep you busy for all the time you should be at work for that week. And somebody comes along and asks you to do something else, and you compulsively say yes because you feel you have to. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about, where in terms of helping people to set healthy boundaries where they say no. Because when you say yes in that kind of situation, it may temporarily please the person who's asking you if you can do it because you've said yes and you're being agreeable, but it's not going to please them very much when it doesn't get done, or it's actually completely inadequate because you've been totally exhausted and you've been burning yourself out trying to finish it at midnight at home with your kids screaming in the background that you can't pay proper attention to.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder whether we can actually start training that in our private lives, where I'm just thinking of the numerous occasions where we say yes to a friend reaching out, wanting to spend time with us, and then we don't want to say no, not to reject them, and then we hang out, but our mind is not there, or we're exhausted, and we cannot give them the presence they actually we're looking forward to when asking us for our time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. Well, boundaries at home are just as important, aren't they, actually, in terms of not allowing yourself to assume that you have to take responsibility for doing absolutely everything. For example, there are plenty of people who are brought up to think of themselves like that, and it's particularly gendered, isn't it? It's still very much so. So I think it's a very important subject for women.
Absolutely, because I think women and many people in minority groups who grew up in a world where they felt that they have to please.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a key thing. Absolutely a key thing to what we do.
Yeah.
I'm quite I'm quite definite with people that I work with that we won't ignore the reality of particularly of intrinsic oppressive frameworks which exist around race and gender and so on, and sexual orientation and so on. Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that if you're looking at why somebody is burning out and the stress that they're under, you can't ignore the context. And if the context includes the fact that they're treated like a dog's body and they're paid less because of their color, their sexual orientation, or their gender, then that's a real problem. There are constant added flow of undermining and microaggressions which are involved in those attitudes.
Yeah.
You can't ignore that.
And
Well,
then
you can
it's a
ignore it.
systemic approach. Yeah.
You can ignore it, but you're not going to have as good an organization as you could.
Yeah. Wow. And then the entire field of unconscious bias opens. That because I think as much as nobody is consciously free riding, very few are consciously discriminating.
That's right, and that's an incredibly important point. People don't have to consciously discriminate or be consciously horrible to actually be very oppressive without even knowing it. And because it's accepted in a certain, excuse me, in certain way, it's accepted as normal. The person it's happening to may not even notice necessarily the buildup of stress and hurt and pain which is associated with it until it actually erupts and they end up getting ill, or they end up burning out or breaking down. But I think it's a very, very real thing.
Yeah. I was thinking of another behavior that we observe very often in organizations. And I wonder whether this is also just a symptom, micromanagement.
Oh, yeah.
Because micromanagement eventually also leads to burnout. And I think, again, nobody is consciously micromanaging, but it seems like a compulsive behavior.
It's driven by fear. Micromanagement is always driven by fear.
Fear of losing control, fear of not delivering,
Fear of
not
losing,
being good enough.
fear of losing their job, fear of survival fear, fundamentally right at the root of it, I think. Yeah. I'm in this place where I've got to prove every day, I've got to prove more. Every day I've got to prove more. And if they come from a background, a childhood or family background, where that's been pounded into them ever since they were tiny, then it's even worse. They're going to be even more frightened. I actually think that most organizations run probably about 60% on fear rather than any kind of logical collaboration.
Yeah.
And if you could change that, if you could significantly change that in any organization, then you would see the most extraordinary explosion of creativity and productivity. I don't think people would credit it. I don't think they'd believe it when they saw it. It would be so big.
And it reminds me of the research that has been done on psychological safety, which shows similar results, right? That the teams most successful, most thriving are those where the members feel psychologically safe, which is the opposite of fear driven.
Yeah, it's absolutely. When you feel safe, then you're in a great place to be able to collaborate. And here's the thing, which is that all the most recent science shows that collaboration is the thing that we love most of all to do. And it's also inbuilt into us at a fundamental level. So social neuroscience shows that actually empathy and collaboration are our superpowers as a species. They're responsible for everything we've managed to achieve.
Which then leads me via one intermediate stop to another topic that I wanted to talk about. So most people love to collaborate. And I wonder whether also collaboration can very often be a means to avoid loneliness, isolation. So I have the impression that the meeting pandemic, where we constantly have to meet, when we are stuck in a project or we cannot advance or we haven't had time to do the work we're supposed to do, let's call for a meeting. And then the bad outcome of a bad meeting are even more meetings.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I wonder whether this is so somehow I have the impression that it might be born out of the discomfort of being alone, feeling isolated.
Well, I think that's a very big part of it. I'm sure that quite often people like to be in meetings because it is social. So it would make sense to make social time and space a far more unstructured and easily accessible quality for people working, wouldn't it?
To basically disentangle this need for social time from the doing the work so that they can satisfy their social time and dedicate it, being more honest about
Well, I think there's
the time they spend.
quite a lot of research has also shown that things like the water dispenser conversations which are had in various workplaces are some of the places where problems get solved, because people are just chatting to each other and they mention something and somebody's got an idea from a completely different division of the company, and it suddenly clicks into place. And they might also be enjoying one another's company or laughing for a bit, and that can only be good for their work, really.
Yeah. Which then posed the question of how to replicate that. And I think that's a challenge many companies who went remote faced, how to replicate the water cooler, this cross-pollination of ideas and connection.
I don't think it's nearly as hard as I think lots of people actually found out how to do it, worked out how to do it. I think that a lot of really good work has been done online as a result of that. I don't really think it's a problem. I do all my stuff is done online, and it's been incredibly successful to work with people on the most sort of charged problems, really, online. In some cases, it actually makes them feel more at ease.
More safe.
They're in their own environment and they're comfortable and more able to genuinely contribute what they have to contribute.
100%. And I think to come to this point of cross-pollination of ideas, the randomization of breaking groups into smaller groups or into pairs, they get the chance to speak to those they would usually not speak to.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I really liked about doing the metaphor landscaping work, was that it's because of the way it's structured, where everyone actually writes down their own thing and they put their own thing up on the board. It means that no one has a louder voice than anyone else. So somebody who's actually quite introverted, they can still get just as much of their thoughts and ideas up there as anyone else.
Yeah.
Also, it takes away any implicit hierarchy amongst the people who are involved in doing it. So there's that as well. It's what they call a socially negotiated metaphor mind map, basically. So I think that works really well. I think that is a really key important part of facilitating well, I would say.
Absolutely, flattening the space and giving everyone a voice, even if it's not verbal, but at least written. Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
And it's also something I observe in trainings I deliver for, especially for these global companies, where employees from all the different units, hierarchies, and countries are joining. And then by being in breakout rooms together, suddenly there are new connections that are formed, new empathy, even, and understanding for each other.
Yeah.
Which is a nice side effect of online training, to actually maintain this water cooler effect while having a shared goal.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah. Yeah, we found that about working with metaphor as well, is that people coming at the same problem from different angles, initially believing that they were probably going to be at loggerheads with one another, when they see the other person describing how they feel about something or a particular part of the process in metaphor, they get an insight into it that they wouldn't otherwise have. And they actually recognize the similarity between that person's metaphor and one of their own and say, oh, hang on a minute. Yeah, I can see the connection between those two. Yeah.
I love that. And it creates a sort of distance between the problem, their own work reality, so that they can actually empathize with it. And it bypasses our natural defense mechanism if we feel attacked because it's too close.
Yes, and they also have a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Which is pretty important as well. It's always good. It's always good in a session like that if there's laughter and chat happening between people who are putting things up.
Yeah.
Oh yes, I thought that was a particularly nuclear bomb part of the whole thing as well, type conversation.
Which brings an entire different quality of facilitation to light, which is creating this ease and laughter even when the topics are difficult. And I think authenticity plays a big role, because if the facilitator tries to be funny or forces this lightness, everyone will cringe because you can feel it, that is uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, I think. one of the most interesting stories like that, I think, is I don't know if you know about Northern Ireland, but in the peace talks in Northern Ireland before the Good Friday Agreement, the two people who got on incredibly well and were always joking with each other all the time were Martin McGuinness and the Reverend Ian Paisley, which is just about the most unlikely combination of people that you can imagine actually ever being able to get on with each other. But they related to each other's sense of humor so well, they ended up becoming known as the Chuckle Brothers.
Beautiful. So, what does it take to create these moments of lightened laughter, chuckle for groups?
Well, of course, I think that the kinds of things that we do for kicking off strategy workshops, strategy days, and things like that are ideal for helping with that kind of thing.
So the
Start off with
memory of positive things.
completely calming down, and then, for example, we would use a guided relaxation, which is designed to help open up all the potential of creativity without any boundaries before people begin to start working on developing strategy together. And that's been incredibly successful every time we've done it.
Which makes total sense, because when I'm stressed, this means my muscles are stiff. Also relating to what you shared about your coaching client who had pain. And if we are stiff, we don't even have the capacity to laugh, because to laugh, we need this relaxation.
Yeah, right. Absolutely, you do. Yeah.
Yeah. And you were speaking about different types of engagement, also with the mirror board and how you invite that. And in our exploration call, we spoke about neurodivergence.
Mm-hmm.
And I have the impression that, or we can see that neurodivergence becomes more, or it used to be something maybe like a taboo. And now that more and more adults get diagnosed with
Yeah.
ADHD, ADD, maybe even autism, I think
Right. I don't
companies.
have a formal diagnosis, but when I go through the questionnaires for both of them, then I can tick an awful lot of the boxes.
Yeah, and I think in the past we've been very quick in labeling those in the neurodiverse spectrum for not being focused, for being all over, not being reliable.
Yeah, we've just launched a free mini course, which is a precursor to a longer course that we're running, particularly for neurodivergent people, helping them to negotiate neurotypical environments. And that, I would like to make absolutely clear, does not mean making them more normal. It means, or getting them to behave as if they're normal. It means actually supporting them in helping to create an environment where they can be recognized for what they can contribute, and also the fact that they do have this difference, which can be catered for.
What I love about that, and I have a few follow-up questions, is that it creates a sense, or that's what I hear, it creates a sense of agency, because it's one thing to say, okay, we have more and more, at least, or neurodivergence becomes more of a topic, and then we have to change organizations so that they become more accommodating, ignoring or disempowering those who are in the situation, because there's nothing they can do. And from what I hear from your course is that there are things that if we identify as neurodivergent, there might be tools or things we can do to create awareness or create a easier environment for ourselves.
I think there are things that can be done to help you cope. We basically decided to do this because over the past 7 years, I've worked with quite a lot of neurodivergent people, and they have actually said to me, you know, you should make this more widely available for neurodivergent people because the techniques are much easier for me as someone with ADHD, for example, than meditation. I can't do meditation, but I can. The guided relaxations are great. They really are. They really help. And it's just a completely different approach. So we decided to do that, and we did a pilot, and we asked a whole lot of people what were the main things, and the three main things that we came up with and decided to focus on were the stress which is produced by people having to constantly mask, which is to attempt to appear to be normal. The stress which comes from being in an environment where there are constant microaggressions happening. And as we said, they're not necessarily deliberate, they're just embedded in the attitudes of normality. And the third one was having what are actually potentially really great qualities conceived of or misunderstood as being problematic behaviors. So, for example, the ability to hyperfocus on something can be seen as being obsessive, but actually, if you're in a lot of circumstances, it's super useful. A great attention to detail that can be seen as being overly fixated on tiny aspects of things. Deep focus and intense concentration can be seen as obsessive behavior, on an inability to shift attention, and so on. But actually, so the last part of the course is actually focused on helping people to reframe what they may have been told are bad things, get them to realize that actually these are superpowers that you've got. These are real advantages that you used in the right way, in the right context, and where organizations are smart enough to recognize what the potentials are and provide the right context, then people can actually contribute an enormous amount.
Yeah. Which
So,
then also relates to a management skill that is the exact opposite of micromanaging, but creating agency for the team so that everyone can really work in their superpowers.
yeah, that's right. And recognizing that for some of us, we may be able to produce a huge amount of work in 2 or 3 hours, but the cognitive load of doing that is such that we then need to spend the next hour and a half in a quiet room somewhere by ourselves without being disturbed by anybody.
And this is the time that we forget to schedule into our calendars, especially in organizations where everyone can book everyone else's time.
Yeah,
How
absolutely.
can we ensure to actually have time after each interaction to digest and calm down our nervous system?
Well, here's the thing, right? Which is that actually adjusting organizations so that they are more aware and more adapted to those sorts of needs isn't just going to be good for people who are neurodivergent. It's going to be good for everybody, because actually you're going to have far less burnout. You're going to have far less overwhelm, because you're giving people the space and the time for them to do what they need to do to just relax, to rebuild themselves a little bit, to get back to where they need to be to do the next thing they want to do.
Yeah. And to reduce these microaggressions that you mentioned, because it's usually just a fight response born out of stress.
Yeah, quite often I think it is. I mean, there are horrible, truly horrible incidents where people are just deliberately vile, but I think hopefully those aren't as marked as they might have been once.
Yeah.
But lots of people who are different in one way or another get those as well.
And we'll put the link to the mini course you just mentioned in the show notes. So if you listen to that, scroll down to the show notes to download it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That'd be accessible.
Everyone's welcome. Yeah. We'd love to get any feedback we can about it as well.
What remains your facilitation challenge?
What's my facilitation challenge? Well, my facilitation challenge personally is that there are about 4 or 5 subjects that if I get onto in the course of facilitating, I have to watch that I don't disappear down the rabbit hole with them, because I am so fascinated by a couple of subjects. One is metaphor, and I actually do an entire day-long workshop on metaphor. So that is a big thing for me. Another one is the default mode network, which I can go on about for quite a long time as well. So I have to be careful. And I usually ask somebody, usually ask people at the outset, I let them know. I've got a couple of hobby horses. If I start going down them, then you're allowed to say, hey, hello.
Mentioned.
I normally keep it pretty well under control.
Yeah, I can see this happening. For me, asking questions is one of those.
Right. Yeah.
Or in general, facilitation skills as a leadership skill is another one.
And the other thing is that I actually really like people, so it's pretty easy for me to end up getting into a fascinating conversation about the price of potatoes with somebody. It's just which is probably great, and it's very friendly and everything, but it might not be exactly on the point of the thing we're trying to facilitate.
And what I love about the way you just explained how you manage this challenge is, again, either pointing someone or giving the group agency to voice when you're going on a tangent or when it's no longer working for them. Yeah. And this again creates a sense of safety, agency, and respect.
Yeah, and I think it also comes from a genuine place of, I'm going to give you as much as I possibly can that I think is going to be useful and helpful to you, but I sure as hell know that I don't know everything.
Mm. Yeah. And then it always depends on the purpose of the workshop or the training, right? If the team is there to achieve a specific goal or outcome, yes, they might need your input. But then what is the trade-off between more input as opposed to progressing on the set goal?
I think one of the best things in any workshop for me is seeing other people fascinated, energized, and being creative and thinking through things themselves and coming up with solutions and ideas and references spontaneously in the group. That's awesome.
Do you set ground rules at the start? Or do these emerge naturally after through the meditation and the...
Yeah, they're pretty simple. They're pretty simple. It depends on what it is. So I did a course in the Stave-based School of the Possible, which was called Liminal Explorations, which was actually about exploring the relationship with the subconscious. So there was a very wide open field, really. And in that case, I just said to everybody, okay, well, there is structure here, and it's structured like this. These are the main blocks we're going to go through, but there's plenty of opportunity to explore side issues if you want to, and everyone wants to go down a particular side avenue for a bit, we can do that. It's not a problem. Yeah, stop me as I'm going through and ask questions as we go. And with a group of 12 to 13 people, that's great. With more than that, with probably like 20 people, it would start getting a bit of a problem. In which case, I guess I'd say, well, we're not really going to have time for questions during the presentation, but there might be some time at the end. and then try and leave time for that afterwards.
Nice. It almost sounds like a choose your own adventure workshop.
A bit, yeah, that one was a lot like that. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
beautiful. According to you,
I was going to say others are more structured. So there are particular workshops on intuition, empathy, rhythms, which includes that rhythms of working and so on, and circadian rhythms and how we need to look after them, and managing complexity is another one. So yeah, if it's more specific, it's more structured.
One other question that I ask all my podcast guests is, what makes a workshop fail?
What makes a workshop fail? Well, there are a few things that as a facilitator you can do to make sure your workshop will fail. One is to have huge amounts of writing on your slides and read directly off the slides in a droning, flat voice.
Death by PowerPoint.
Yeah, that's right. But everyone knows that one. The other thing is that I think is the thing that really could make it fail, I think, is to not spend a little bit of time thinking about how to put people at ease and how to bring them into the process and make them feel that they are part of it and that it's interesting. What's really interesting about what you're going to say? What interests them?
Yeah.
So,
Reminds me of the saying, connection over content.
I think that's probably a good one. Yeah.
And that we have to connect the participants to the purpose and to each other and to themselves. Because if
Yeah.
we don't know why we're there, why we're spending our time and attention,
Yeah.
it's very difficult to actually be present,
Yeah.
creative.
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Thank you. We've almost used all the time. Was there something you would have liked to talk about that we haven't covered in our conversation?
Let me see. I guess I think it would be good to maybe just talk a little bit about how important and significant the stories that we tell are. The stories we tell about ourselves, about each other, and about our organization, the stories that the organization tells us. And that's a big part of what we do as well with liminal coaching, because the guided relaxations are always also stories. And story is unbelievably powerful at affecting people at a subconscious level. So that's a great way. It's always great, isn't it? In a workshop, if you're facilitating, it's always wonderful to start off with a story, especially if it's funny and it engages people. But a story can illustrate an immense amount of nuance in a very short amount of time.
I love that. And it creates the mental images
Yeah.
that then make it easier to connect to and to remember. It creates emotions that we'll remember better than the content.
Yeah. So one simple tip here about imagination and stories is that they did research which showed that people who had been unable to stop thinking about dreadful things that had happened to their relatives, not that they happened to them, but that had happened to people that they knew or were their relatives, unable to stop thinking about it, unable to stop imagining it, they ended up needing treatment for genuine PTSD. So this is how powerful your imagination is, right? So we always say to people, there are two things which will really make a big difference is if you find yourself negatively ruminating about the past or negatively predicting the future, try to do anything you can to stop that and to think about something else, even if it's pinching yourself or drinking a glass of water or whatever. Because strongly imagining a negative event will add almost as much stress to your stress reservoir as the actual event. So as we like to say, you imagine that you're going to go to a meeting. It's probably going to be okay. They usually are. But you start worrying about it. And you think about everything that could go wrong. You think about it 50 times, 50 different occasions, 50 different types of disaster. You have the meeting. It's absolutely fine. And that's great. The problem is that you've been to 51 meetings and 50 of them have been a disaster. And all of that stress has actually got added to your stress reservoir.
And it relates directly to what you shared about the thought of a nice cup of coffee. For instance, if someone likes coffee, it creates serotonin and hence happiness. So obviously, I would say the same is true when we think of negative things.
Yes, it's just that I think because we're in the West, we're so used to saying it's just imagination, as if that didn't mean anything. It's very easy for us to forget just how very powerful that is.
And it reminds me of research, or it was a clip that was shown of people who had the hand below a protecting surface, but then a replication of the hand on top of it. So it seemed as if it was the hand, but it was clearly not. And then there was something falling on it so that it looked as if it would cause pain, but it clearly didn't cause physical pain because the hand was protected, and still they felt it.
Right. Yeah.
And
yeah.
I think this just shows how powerful our imagination is. And because we see it, we can imagine the pain, and hence we feel it.
Yeah. And that's a very key part of what we do, is using the imagination in the most constructive way. Yeah.
Beautiful work. Thank you so much for your generous sharing. And I just from this interview, I feel already calmer and more creative and this new headspace.
Great. I'm pleased to hear it. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.